Dust rose in ropes behind the old Ford, and Verlene Ashworth walked ahead of it barefoot, dragging a chain through red Kansas dirt. Behind her, a trench. Behind the trench, more trench, curling out across the pasture like the coil of a rattler settling into shade. She carried a bucket of bare root saplings on her hip, roots wrapped in wet burlap, and every 20 feet she knelt and pressed one into the earth like she was tucking in a child. The wind combed the grass flat. She didn't flinch from it. She just kept walking the crooked line, planting trees where no fence, no crop, no reason seemed to call for them. By sundown she had a mile of saplings leaning sideways in fresh soil, arranged in a shape none of her neighbors could make sense of from the road. Not straight rows, not a square border, a long, deliberate curve, doubling back on itself twice before running out toward the section line. Cars slowed on Route 9 to look. Some folks pointed. One farmer just shook his head and drove on. Whatever Verlene Ashworth was building out there in Comfrey County, she wasn't telling anyone, and the shape of it kept them guessing long after their headlights had gone. If a story like this one finds you at the right hour of your evening, go ahead and hit subscribe before you forget. Channels like this only grow because someone decided to stick around. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the map you're watching from tonight. I read every one, and I like knowing whose porch light this story is keeping company with. Comfrey County sits in the flat middle of Kansas, where the land runs so open you can watch weather arrive an hour before it does. The town of Talmadge holds a feed store, a Lutheran church with a crooked steeple, and a diner where the coffee's been the same nickel too cheap since 1974. Verlene had lived on the Ashworth place for 31 years, since she married Denny Ashworth at 19, and moved into his grandfather's farmhouse with a leaking roof and a good well. Denny died 4 winters back, heart giving out in the middle of baling hay, and left her 400 acres, a mortgage half paid, and a boy in high school who still set the table for 2. Verlene kept the farm running on wheat and stubbornness. She rose before light, same as always, and made coffee in the same dented percolator Denny's mother had used. Some mornings she'd catch herself pouring 2 cups before she remembered. She'd pour the second one out on the porch step for the dog, an old blue heeler named Scraps, and call it habit rather than grief. Her son Marlon, 17, drove the grain truck now and did a man's chores before school. He never complained. He just watched his mother work longer hours than any 2 men in the county, and worried about her in the quiet way boys do when they don't yet have the words for it. The trouble came in a government envelope. Verlene had signed onto a federal soil conservation cost-share contract 2 years prior, the kind that paid half the cost of planting a shelterbelt if she matched the funds, and kept the trees alive to a certain survival rate by a certain date. She'd used the last of Denny's life insurance to buy her half of 6,000 saplings. If the windbreak didn't establish, if she couldn't prove, by the county agent's autumn inspection, that most of those trees had taken root and would live, she'd owe the government back every dollar of the cost-share money. Money she'd already spent. Money that didn't exist anymore. At the feed store, Odell Caston liked to hold court by the seed bins, and he held forth plenty on Verlene's trees. 20 acres of switchgrass and saplings, and not an inch of it in wheat, he told anybody who'd listen, tapping ash from his cigarette onto the floor. Woman's out there planting a maze for gophers while her own bills stack up. Denny would have had that ground in winter wheat by now, God rest him. Nadine Fenwick, who ran the diner counter, defended her some. She's got her reasons, Odell, mind your own crop. But even Nadine admitted over pie that the shape of those tree rows made no sense to her either. Verlene didn't argue with any of them. She kept driving to the co-op 40 miles off to buy saplings other farmers had given up on, undersized, root-bound, the kind sold at a steep discount because nobody else wanted the gamble. She hauled home truckloads of Osage orange, red cedar, and bur oak, species so tough Denny used to call them the trees that argue back. She planted them not along her fence lines, where a normal shelter belt might run straight and tidy, but in long looping curves that bent around the house and barn from 3 directions, thickest on the southwest side, where Kansas wind and weather liked to come from. Marlin helped her most evenings after chores, though even he asked, one night while tamping soil around a cedar no taller than his knee, "Mama, why not just plant 'em straight like everybody else does? Be a lot less digging." Verlene wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked out at the curve of trees already leaning in the wind. "Your daddy's grandfather used to say the wind doesn't travel straight, so why should the trees that stop it?" she said. "I read about it in an old conservation bulletin from the 30s. Curved rows break the wind different than straight ones. Slow it down instead of just standing in front of it." She didn't tell Marlin the rest, that she'd found the design in a water-stained pamphlet in Denny's grandfather's desk, printed after the Dust Bowl, describing how certain Kansas towns had planted their shelter belts in long S-curves and horseshoe bends instead of straight lines, because the old foresters believed a curved windbreak didn't just block wind, it turned it, the way a river bends a current instead of damming it outright. Nobody in Comfrey County had planted that way in 80 years. Most had forgotten the idea existed at all. Verlene had found it, underlined twice in pencil, in her dead husband's handwriting from a college class he'd taken and never finished. July brought no rain for 3 straight weeks, and Verlene watched a full third of her new saplings curl brown at the tips. She walked the rows at dusk with a 5-gallon bucket in each hand, hauling well-watered tree by tree because she couldn't afford to run the pump long enough to irrigate properly. Marlin found her sitting in the dirt one evening between 2 dead cedars, not crying, just staring at the brittle needles like they'd personally betrayed her. "Maybe Odell's right," she said quietly, the closest she'd come to quitting since Denny died. "Maybe I've spent money we didn't have on a fence made of dead sticks." She almost called the county agent the next morning to withdraw from the contract, to cut her losses before the autumn survival count made things worse. She had the phone in her hand, the number half-dialed. When Marlin came in from the barn holding something in his cupped palms, a fledgling meadowlark, nested low in the grass at the edge of the tree line, alive only because the young saplings had broken enough wind to keep last week's hailstorm from flattening its nest. He didn't say a word about the trees. He just set the bird gently back where he found it. Verlene hung up the phone. She changed her watering strategy after that, hauling water only to the strongest third of the trees, letting the weakest go, concentrating what little she had where it would do the most good. It was a hard, practical choice, the kind Denny used to make about which calves to bottle feed and which to let a mother reject. By August, the surviving saplings had toughened into the heat, roots reaching deeper for what moisture the ground still held. The curve of green along the southwest side of the house grew thicker, knee-high now in most places, waist-high in the oldest sections planted 2 seasons back. The county agent, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Pruce, came out in September to walk the rows with his clipboard and his survival rate calculator. He didn't say much, just counted and made notes, and Verlene followed behind him with her stomach in a knot, watching him tally the numbers that would decide whether she kept her farm or owed the government money she flat did not have. When he finished, he told her the survival rate had cleared the contract's minimum by a narrow 4%. Verlene didn't celebrate. She just sat down on the tailgate of her truck and let herself breathe for what felt like the first time in months. Word got back to the feed store fast, the way anything involving a government inspector always did in Comfrey County. Odell allowed that maybe Verlene had gotten lucky, nothing more. "Trees living don't prove they're worth a thing," he said. "Prove me a windbreak does something a straight fence line couldn't, and I'll eat my hat." Nadine just refilled his coffee without comment. Nobody in town had ever seen what those curved rows were actually built to do, because nobody in living memory had watched Comfrey County take a direct hit from a real tornado. Not since 1966, before most of them were born. That changed on the second Tuesday of May the following spring, when the sky over the county turned the color of a fresh bruise by 4 in the afternoon. The radio in Nadine's diner crackled with a warning, then a second one, sharper. Verlene had heard that particular stillness in the air before, the kind old-timers called tornado quiet, when even the meadowlarks go silent and the cicadas stop mid-note. She sent Marlin to the storm cellar first, grabbed Scraps by the collar and looked once, hard, at the black funnel dropping out of the clouds 3 miles west, aimed, it seemed, straight down the section line toward her house. She didn't have time to think about trees. She had time only to get down the cellar steps and pull the door shut over their heads, the iron latch cold and slick under her palm, while the world above turned into a freight train roar that pressed against her eardrums like water pressure at the bottom of a lake. Marlin held Scraps against his chest. Verlene held Marlin's hand and said nothing, because there was nothing worth saying over a sound like that, and because whatever was happening to her 20 acres of trees right now was completely and entirely out of her hands. The roar passed in under 2 minutes. It felt like an hour. When Verlene finally cracked the cellar door and climbed the steps into daylight, the air smelled like split cedar and wet earth, sharp and green and strange. She stood in her own front yard, dust still hanging in slow curtains around her, and turned in a full circle to take in what was left. The house stood. The barn stood. The old percolator was still sitting on the porch rail exactly where she'd left it that morning, not even knocked over. Every window in the place was intact. It was Marlin who saw it first, walking to the edge of the yard where the curved rows of trees stood torn and half stripped of leaves but upright. Most of them, still rooted, still standing in their long bending line. Beyond them, past the southwest curve, the fields lay scoured bare in a wide gouged path, fence posts snapped off at the ground, a grain bin folded flat like a soda can, 300 yards of Odell Caston's own wheat stubble scraped clean down to dirt. The tornado's track ran arrow straight across the open ground until it reached Verlene's trees, and there, the destruction simply stopped. Odell drove out himself 2 days later, once the county road crews cleared the debris enough to pass. He walked the tree line slowly, running his hand along a split but still standing cedar trunk, following the scoured path of the storm with his eyes from where it tore through open pasture to where it seemed to lift, stagger, and lose its footing against Verlene's curved rows before scattering off toward the section line, sparing the house entirely. He didn't say a word for a long while. Then he took his hat off, turned it over once in his hands, and set it back on his head without putting it on right. By the following week, half of Comfrey County had driven out past the Ashworth place at least once, slowing their trucks along Route 9 the same way they had 2 years before, except now they parked and got out and walked the fence line themselves. Gerald Pruce came back out with a different clipboard this time, from the state forestry office, taking photographs of the storm track where it met the curved shelter belt, measuring the angle where the debris field bent and scattered instead of continuing straight. He didn't lecture anybody about wind shear or turbulence. He just pointed his camera at the torn stubble on one side of the trees and the untouched porch rail on the other, and let the two pictures sit side by side. Nadine put a photograph of the tree line up behind the diner counter, right next to the calendar from the Lutheran church. Odell never did eat his hat, but he did order 600 saplings from the same co-op Verlene used, and he asked her, plain as anything, to walk his ground with him and show him where the curves ought to bend. Verlene didn't gloat, and she didn't lecture. She went back to hauling water buckets, tending the weak trees along with the strong ones now that the drought had broken, same as she had every evening for 2 years running. Marlin still set the table for 2 most mornings out of old habit, but some mornings now he set it for 3, in case Nadine's boy came by early to help with chores, and Verlene let that be a nice enough sign of things mending, even if nobody said so out loud. What she'd planted wasn't a fence, and it wasn't a maze. It was a long green argument against the wind, curved the way her husband's grandfather once believed a windbreak ought to curve. And it had held its ground the one time it mattered most. Comfrey County still tells it as the year the storm went looking for the Ashworth place and got turned around by a woman who'd read an old man's forgotten pencil marks and trusted them more than she trusted her neighbor's laughter. And to this day, Nobody in that county plants a straight row of trees without somebody mentioning Verlene's curve, and the porch rail the wind never touched.